Welcome to the 13 Days of Halloween Marathon, where we will be taking a look at the history of horror films, broken down in a span of only 13 days. For our first review, we'll be going all the way back to Germany in 1920 with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. The film is essentially a flashback told by a man named Francis who had a traumatic experience with his fiancée the night before. While Francis and his fiancée were staying in a town in Germany, a mad magician by the name of Dr. Caligari stops by the town fair to show off his attraction. That being an eerie and bizarre-looking person who Dr. Caligari has complete control over. Soon, under Caligari's orders, Caesar, the mindless sleepwalking attraction, begins to murder people around the city and is used as a pawn for Caligari's further bloodlust against Francis, who Caligari is ultimately jealous of because of his fiancée. Caligari wants the fiancée, and uses a sleepwalking murdering Caesar to do his evil bidding for him. However, Caesar's downfall comes when the fiancée's beauty makes him question his master's orders and decides to take her for himself against Caligari's wishes, leading to his inevitable downfall. Caesar can be seen carrying her around the town reminiscent of many films that would come later, such as Creature from the Black Lagoon and King Kong, where the monster develops an attachment to a human woman, something that would come into conflict with the monster's very nature as a destructive and nefarious force. Why is this movie so significant? Well, to put it bluntly, this film can very well be considered the first true horror film. Yet, despite the fact that horror films have existed arguably since George Méliès's The Castle of the Devil in 1896, up until 1920, horror films were largely meant to entertain people rather than frighten them. Films such as 1908's The Haunted House or The Red Spectre lacked shock value, and while there are plenty of creepy images within those short films, it was the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari which really defined and influenced horror massively. But to understand the nature of the film, one must look at German Expressionism, a particular post-war German art movement, as an element of the film that should be examined. After the First World War, Germany, hurt massively by the costs of the war and the penalties which came along due to involvement in the war itself, saw an increased need of escapism, which led to the emergence of the German Expressionist movement, a movement which emphasized distorted and fantastical Gothic visuals in order to convey a story, a theme Caligari follows hugely. The windows are misshapen, the houses look like houses from a fairy tale, and extensive use of shadows are used. Since it was a silent movie, the visuals had to play such a pivotal part as a means to convey the plot as well as everything else that was happening to the audience accurately. As a result of this, actors' expressions are exaggerated, and in terms of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, the visuals are pivotal in telling a story which may seem so bizarre to the average audience member in 1920. With all of that being said, why is this film so important to the horror genre? Well, because many would argue it's one of the most influential horror films of all time, if not the most influential. In fact, for instance, Tim Burton's whole art style is practically taken from it. Burton took certain elements of German Expressionism as well as the Gothic elements seen in Caligari and implemented it into his own work, yet giving the elements his own unique twist. Many of Burton's films look as though they'd fit right in with this movie. It's a genuinely creepy and fascinating piece of history, and a great first film for the 13 Days of Halloween.
Great Halloween parties begin at Walgreens. Candy, party decorations, masks, costumes, makeup. Everything you need for Halloween fun now at Walgreens.
Creepy crawlers, creepy crawlers, creepy crawlers.
Now, you can make all kinds of lovely things like these with Mattel's wonderful Thing Maker. It makes creepy crawlers, spiders, lizards, snakes, dragonflies. Make them yourself with this nice plastic goop. Choose a mold, pour in the goop, heat it, and presto changeo, you've got bugs. Squiggly, squirty bugs. They feel so soft and natural. You get 4 different colors of goop and special paints. Make charming lizard pins or spider rings. You can collect them or spread them around. After all, they're fun for the entire family. Get Mattel's new Thing Maker with creepy crawlers. You can tell it's Mattel. It's swell.
Everybody's heading for Woolworth. Woolworth and Woolco to get set for Halloween. There's costumes of TV favorites like Wonder Woman and the Hulk. There's popular characters from Star Wars. And there's superheroes like Spider-Man, Batman, Superman, and many more at bare bones prices. $2.38 to $4.17. And there's Spook Sticks, Face Pops, Hallowitches, wrapped candy of every kind, all at the favorite Halloween haunts. Woolworth and Woolco.
The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1920 remains one of the most creepy and influential horror films ever made. But there is another German expressionist movie that's just as, if not even more influential, that was released around the same time, in 1922, and in Germany. Nosferatu. Nosferatu is a silent horror film that must be seen to be believed. While vastly different in some areas, the film is the first film adaptation of Dracula in cinema history and retains the German expressionistic style. The vampire, Count Orlok, has become an icon both within the horror genre and elsewhere, and images that come from the film are some of the most famous in film history. And even though the creators of the film couldn't actually get the rights to Dracula, they decided to make their own take on the novel anyway, with massive changes. Further, while silent films in Europe dealt with more supernatural elements, the films released in the United States dealt more with established literature, with films getting released such as The Hunchback of Notre Dame or The Phantom of the Opera. Lon Chaney Sr. would play both Quasimodo and the Phantom, and he had made a name for himself since he was always doing his own FX makeup and acted wonderfully within the realm of silent horror. In fact, he passed away in 1930, right when the sound age of horror began. Overall, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a film that just gives me a creepy feeling. I think it's safe to say silent horror films with distorted visuals just have an antique sense of dread and horror which future films really lacked. But once the 1930s came, a new era of horror had emerged when sound films made their debut.